Della Marsh became a widow at 19 on a Tuesday in November, and a baker by necessity 3 weeks later, when the landlord of the building where she and her late husband had lived came to collect the overdue rent, and she did not have it. Her husband's name was Tommy. He had been 22 years old and had worked construction, and had been the kind of young man who was genuinely good at being alive, the specific quality of people who move through the world with an easy warmth that made everyone around them feel the benefit of it. He had died on a Wednesday morning when the scaffolding on a building site outside of town had failed in a way that the subsequent investigation described as preventable, which was the word that Della had circled in the report when she received it, and which she had thought about every day since, in the way you thought about words that captured the full extent of something without making it any smaller. She was 19 years old. She had been married for 8 months. She was living in a 2-room apartment above a hardware store on Clement Street in the town of Aldervale, which had 4,000 people and 1 traffic light, and a community that had expressed its condolences with the genuine warmth of a small town that knew Tommy and had liked him and was sorry in the specific way of people for whom sorry was not a formal expression, but a real feeling that they did not quite know what to do with. What they had done with it was bring food. For 2 weeks after Tommy's funeral, people had brought food to the apartment above the hardware store in the way that Aldervale people brought food to those who needed it, without ceremony and without expectation of anything in return. Casseroles and pies and loaves of bread and boxes of biscuits and a ham from the Hendersons who lived 3 blocks over and who had known Tommy since he was 12. Della had eaten the food and had been grateful for it, and had spent the 2 weeks in the particular suspension of normal function that grief produced, moving through the days with the specific numbness of someone whose nervous system had decided that full sensation was temporarily inadvisable, and had reduced everything to a manageable frequency. On the 15th day, she had woken up and understood that the suspension was over, and the situation was what it was, and that the situation required her to do something, because the alternative to doing something was not an option she was prepared to accept. The situation was this. The apartment cost $140 a month. Tommy's construction wage had been the household income, and it was gone. The compensation from the site investigation was in a legal process that Tommy's mother had initiated with a lawyer from the city, and that would take a long time and produce an outcome nobody could predict with confidence. Della had $70 in the account they had shared, and she had her own checking account that had been a personal account before the marriage, and that she had maintained separately, and that currently held $230, which was the sum of her savings from the waitressing work she had done before the wedding and in the months since, on the days when Tommy had not needed the car. She also had, which she had not fully registered as an asset until the morning she sat up in the 15-day silence and decided to inventory what she actually had, the ability to bake, not in the modest sense of the word, in the sense of a skill that had been given to her by her grandmother May over the entirety of her childhood, the specific, systematic transmission of knowledge that happened when a person who understood something deeply spent years teaching it to a child who had the aptitude and the attention for it. Her grandmother had baked professionally for 40 years in a commercial kitchen in a city 2 hours away before retiring to Aldervale, and the knowledge she had passed to Della was the knowledge of a professional rather than a hobbyist, the understanding of flour and fat and leavening and temperature and time that was different in kind from the understanding produced by following recipes. Della could bake the way some people could draw, with an intuitive fluency that was the result of both aptitude and years of deliberate practice. And she had never thought of it as anything other than the thing she did because her grandmother had taught her, and because she loved it. On the 15th day, she thought of it differently. She was in the kitchen of the apartment when the thought arrived, standing at the counter with the last of the flour from the bag she had opened the previous week, and making bread, because making bread was the thing she did when she needed to think, and the bread needed to be made regardless. She was shaping the loaves with the automatic confidence of someone for whom the motion was so practiced it required nothing conscious, and the thought arrived while her hands were doing what her hands knew how to do. She had a skill. She had $230, and she had seen, on a walk she had taken the previous week, because staying inside the apartment was becoming impossible, that the bakery on the corner of Marsh Street and Aldervale Road was empty. Not recently empty, the kind of empty that accumulated in a commercial premises over a period of years, the specific quality of vacancy that was different from a business that had closed last month. The windows had the interior dimness of a space that had been without active occupation for long enough that the dust had settled in layers and the light had stopped trying to penetrate it. There was a notice on the door that she had read from the pavement without approaching it, because approaching it would have meant taking the thought seriously, and she had not been ready to take it seriously until now. She put the loaves in the oven. She put on her coat and walked to the corner of Marsh Street and Aldervale Road. The notice on the bakery door was from the County Estate Administration Office. It said the premises were in the custody of the county following the death of the owner, a woman named Pearl Watkins, and the failure of the estate to identify a qualifying heir. The notice invited inquiries to the county office regarding the property's future disposition. Della wrote down the number. She went home and took the bread out of the oven and called the number. The county office put her through to a woman named Janet, who had the efficient patience of someone who handled estate property inquiries regularly and had learned to deliver the relevant information in a sequence that covered the most common questions without requiring them to be asked. Janet said the bakery had been Pearl Watkins's for 31 years. Pearl had died 18 months ago at the age of 84. The estate had been in administration since then. The property had a nominal outstanding liability attached to it from an administrative process that had reduced the county's claim to a figure of $200. The premises were available for acquisition at the liability amount if a qualified buyer could be identified. Della asked what qualified meant. Janet said in this context it meant someone who could demonstrate the funds to cover the liability and who had a stated intention for the property. Della said she had $230 and she intended to bake in it. Janet was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would need to process a formal application and that the timeline was approximately 3 weeks and that Della should come to the county office with identification and the funds. Della said she would be there in the morning. She went to the apartment and sat at the kitchen table with the bread cooling on the rack and her notebook open in front of her and wrote down everything she knew how to make. She wrote for 2 hours. She went to the county office in the morning. 3 weeks later, she had a deed and $200 left in the bank, and a key to a bakery on the corner of Marsh Street and Aldervale Road. The bakery was smaller inside than the corner position suggested. The front area, which had been the customer-facing space, was approximately 300 square feet, with a service counter along the back wall, and the display cases that Pearl had used still in place, their glass clouded with 18 months of dust, but structurally present. Behind the counter was the kitchen, which was where the 400 square feet that constituted the meaningful space of the premises was located, and which was what Della went to first. Pearl had been a professional baker for 31 years. The kitchen showed this in every aspect of its organization. The commercial oven along the back wall was a piece of equipment that had been purchased with serious intent and maintained with serious care. The kind of oven that a baker bought when they intended to be baking for a long time and needed the equipment to be reliable throughout. The prep surfaces were heavy timber, worn smooth with use, in the specific way of surfaces that had been used correctly for decades. The shelving was organized with the logic of a person who had developed a system over years and had refined it until the system was invisible, because everything was simply in the right place. Della stood in the center of Pearl's kitchen and turned slowly. She was 20 years old. She had $200, a deed, and a grandmother's 40 years of knowledge in her hands. She began to clean. She spent the first week cleaning. She was thorough in the way her grandmother had taught her to be thorough about a kitchen, which was the thoroughness of someone who understood that the kitchen's condition was the condition of everything made in it, and that there were no shortcuts in the cleaning that did not eventually become shortcuts in the baking. She cleaned surfaces and equipment and the oven, which required 2 full days because the oven had not been cleaned since Pearl had left it, and cleaning it properly meant understanding how it worked. And Pearl's oven worked in the way of things built in a specific era with a specific quality of construction that rewarded the understanding it required. On the 4th day of cleaning, she found the cupboard. Not a hidden cupboard, a kitchen cupboard, fitted beneath the prep surface on the left wall, that she had cleaned around on the first pass because the door had been stuck and she had decided to return to it. She returned to it on the 4th day with a flathead screwdriver and the patience she brought to things that required patience rather than force. The door opened. Inside the cupboard were Pearl's recipe books. Not 1 or 2, 17 of them arranged on a shelf that had been fitted inside the cupboard specifically to hold them. The shelf constructed from the same heavy timber as the prep surface and fitted with a lip along the front edge to keep the books in place. The books were of various types and ages, some clearly purchased and some clearly made. The handmade ones, constructed from paper, gathered and bound with a binding that was practical rather than decorative. She took the oldest-looking one out first. The writing inside was in a hand she did not know, the specific, small, precise handwriting of someone who had been taught penmanship in an era when penmanship was taught as a discipline. The recipes were written in full, not the abbreviated shorthand of someone writing for themselves, but the complete, detailed instructions of someone writing for transmission, for a reader who would need everything explained, rather than just the parts the writer might forget. The date at the front was 1923. Della turned pages. The recipes were in a tradition she recognized in the structural way that a baker recognized traditions. The specific combination of ingredients and methods that spoke to a regional and historical context that she had read about in the baking history her grandmother had given her when she was 14, with the instruction that understanding where a thing came from was part of understanding the thing itself. She sat on the kitchen floor with the recipe book and read for an hour. She found the note at the back of the book, tucked inside the back cover, folded twice, in a different hand than the recipes, a hand she would later establish was Pearl's. The note said that the book had belonged to Pearl's grandmother Etta, who had been a baker in the tradition of the community she had grown up in, and that the recipes in the book were Etta's own, developed over 30 years of professional baking in a tradition that had been largely undocumented, and that Etta had written down specifically because she had understood that undocumented traditions did not survive the loss of the people who carried them. Pearl had written that she had baked from this book for 31 years, and that the recipes had been the foundation of everything she had made, and that whoever came after her should know where they came from. Della sat on the floor of Pearl's kitchen and held the book for a long time. Then she went back to the cupboard. She took out every one of the 17 books and arranged them on the prep surface in the order their dates suggested. She opened each one and read the first pages and understood, with the growing clarity of someone whose training had given her the specific literacy for this material, that the 17 books were a continuous record spanning from Etta's original documentation in 1923 through the decades of Pearl's practice and development. They were not simply recipes, they were a body of work, the organized, documented record of a baking tradition developed over decades by two women, the foundational work done by Etta, and the 31 years of application and development done by Pearl. The two together constituting something that Della's grandmother May had the specific vocabulary to assess, and that Della was going to call her about. She called May that evening. May was 78 and had retired from the commercial kitchen in the city and had moved to Aldervale specifically to be close to Della, a decision she had made quietly and without announcement when Tommy died, and that Della had understood was the kind of decision you did not argue with. May listened to the description of the books and what they contained, and what Della understood about their significance. She was quiet for a long time after Della finished. Then she said she wanted to come and see them. She came the following morning. She spent 3 hours with the books on the prep surface, reading in the focused way she had always read things that required her full attention, moving through the pages with the professional literacy of 40 years in commercial kitchens and the specific knowledge of a woman who understood the history of the tradition documented in those pages. When she finished, she sat in the kitchen with Della and said what she had found. She said the recipes in Etta's original book were not just documentation of a regional tradition, they were the original documentation. The specific techniques recorded in the book were techniques that were referenced in the academic literature on American baking history as having existed but not having been recorded in primary sources. She had read about this in a baking history journal 2 years ago, an article about the gap in the documentary record for this specific regional tradition, and the efforts being made to find primary sources. She said the book in Della's hand was possibly one of those primary sources. She said the full 17-book collection, Etta's original work, and Pearl's 31-year development of it was something she had never seen in one place before, and was not sure anyone had. Della looked at the books on the prep surface. She thought about Pearl baking from these books for 31 years. Pearl, who had died at 84, with no heirs, and a bakery that had sat empty for 18 months, with 17 books in a stuck cupboard, waiting for someone who would understand what they were. She thought about Tommy and the word preventable circled in a report. She thought about $70 and $230 and a 15-day silence, and a thought that had arrived while her hands were doing what they knew how to do. May said she wanted to contact a colleague at the Culinary Institute in the city, a woman named Dr. Ruth Carr, who had published on American baking history and who would know precisely what they had. Della said she should call. May called Dr. Carr the following morning. Dr. Carr drove to Aldervale 4 days later. Dr. Carr was 61 years old and had the focused energy of a person for whom the work had never become routine, and who arrived at the bakery kitchen on a Wednesday morning and stood in front of the 17 books arranged on the prep surface and went very still. She was still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she said, in the careful voice of a professional managing their response to something significant, that she needed to sit down. She sat at the kitchen table, and Della brought her tea, and May sat across from her, and Dr. Carr looked at the books and asked if she could begin with the oldest one. She read for 2 hours. She read with the focused attention of someone for whom reading this material was not recreational, but professional, making notes in her own notebook, in a handwriting that was small and dense, and that covered pages quickly. She asked Della and May questions at intervals without looking up, the questions of someone who was verifying understanding rather than gathering information. When she reached the 17th book, she went back to the first and read 3 specific sections again, cross-referencing with her notes. Then she put her pen down. She said that what she was looking at was what she thought it was, which was the most complete primary source documentation of the tradition she had been researching for 11 years, and that the academic literature had described as insufficiently documented. She said that Etta's original book alone would be significant. She said the 17-book collection was something she did not have the language to characterize quickly without understating it. She said she needed to ask Della several questions about the legal status of the material. Della said she owned the premises and its contents by deed. Dr. Carr said she needed to speak to her institute's legal department to be certain of the implications of that, but that her preliminary understanding was that Della's ownership of the premises extended to the contents, and that the 17 books were therefore Della's. She said the Institute had a program for significant acquisitions of historical culinary documentation. She said the program involved the digitization and academic publication of the material in partnership with the original owner, who retained ownership of the physical documents and received a consideration from the Institute for the access and publication rights. She said the consideration for a collection of this significance would be determined by a formal assessment process, but that she could say with confidence that it would be substantial. Della looked at her grandmother across the kitchen table. May looked back at her with the expression she had worn when she moved to Aldervale after Tommy died. The specific expression of a woman who had made a decision she believed in and was watching it prove correct. Della looked at the 17 books. She thought about Etta in 1923, sitting down to write what she knew, because she understood that undocumented traditions did not survive. She thought about Pearl baking from those books for 31 years and adding her own 31 years to the record, and leaving the whole collection in a cupboard with a stuck door, in a kitchen she had left the way someone left a kitchen when they expected to come back. She thought about a 19-year-old widow with $200 and a skill in her hands, and a thought that had arrived while she was shaping bread. She said yes to Dr. Carr. She said she would need to see the formal assessment and the agreement, and that she wanted to understand every part of it before she signed anything, which was the instinct of a woman who had been left with nothing once and had decided that understanding what she agreed to was not a luxury, but a requirement. Dr. Carr said that was entirely appropriate, and that the Institute's process was thorough and transparent, and that Della should take whatever time she needed. She left with photographs of each page of each book, and a promise to have the formal proposal ready within 3 weeks. After she left, Della and May sat in Pearl's kitchen with the 17 books on the prep surface and the commercial oven along the back wall, and the heavy timber prep surfaces worn smooth with 3 decades of serious work. May said she was going to teach Della the rest of what she knew. Della said she thought she already knew most of it. May said she had kept a few things back. Della looked at her grandmother. May said that was the prerogative of a teacher. She said it with the specific quality of humor she deployed when she was also being completely serious. Della said she was listening. May stood up and went to the oven and checked the temperature gauge with the automatic gesture of someone who checked oven temperatures the way other people checked the time, constantly and without thinking about it. She said the oven was ready. She said they should bake something. Della opened Etta's book to the first recipe. She read it through once from the beginning, the way her grandmother had taught her to read a recipe before she began, as a complete thing rather than a sequence of steps. Then she began to gather the ingredients. Outside on the corner of Marsh Street and Aldervale Road, the bakery that had been Pearl's for 31 years and had been empty for 18 months and had been Della's for 3 weeks, was doing what bakeries did when someone was working in them, which was filling the air around them with a smell that reached the pavement and traveled down the street in the direction of the wind. People on Marsh Street slowed as they passed. One woman stopped completely and stood on the pavement and looked at the bakery window with the expression of someone encountering something they had missed without fully knowing they were missing it. Inside, Della baked. She was 20 years old, and she was a widow, and she had $200 in the bank and 17 books on the prep surface, and her grandmother's 40 years standing beside her, and the knowledge in her hands that had always been there and had simply been waiting, like the books in the cupboard, for the right door to open. She kept baking.